When the dust settled on the gold fields, nights came alive with fiddles between tents. Makeshift stages glowing by lantern light, and rough boots learning new steps. Tonight we'll wander those evenings with the diggers and their families, where music, theater, and dancing offered a little fortune of their own. Before we step in, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what the local time is for you. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through the past, please like and subscribe. By day the goldfields were all hard angles and patient hope, girls and boys trailing behind men whose hands were already raw from pick and shovel, the steady scrape of spades and the wet metallic promise of sluice boxes, the sun catching every speck of dust and sweat, until the horizon seemed to glitter with fevered possibility. It was a place measured in long hours and small gains, where each glitter might mean a fortune or another day's toil. But when the day's labors dimmed and the rattle of pans slowed to a tired hush, another life took hold among the tents and shanties. Lanterns were lit, campfires were banked, and neighbors gathered as naturally as breath. Someone would lift a fiddle, a battered guitar, or a tinny accordion, or simply clap a rhythm on the side of a crate, and the sound pulled people in from the cold and the dark. Voices rose to meet the tune. Old ballads hauled up from memory, new bawdy songs that mocked the day's misfortunes, and tender melodies that turned the dust to something softer for a few hours. Children learned the choruses first, and then the steps, their feet stamping a beat on the hard-packed ground, while women and men exchanged stories and the day's small news. Where there was room, boards became a stage, a wagon platform, a pile of crates, a cleared patch before a row of tents. These were the makeshift theaters of the diggings. Skits and readings, loud impersonations, and harmless gossip were acted out with gusto. Costumes came from trunks or were improvised from spare shirts and aprons. A borrowed hat or a shawl could turn a coal-blackened laborer into a dashing hero or a haughty dame. The plays were never grand, but they were earnest, full of exaggerated gestures, hearty applause, and the warm reflection of the audience's own hopes and follies under flickering candlelight. Dancing was perhaps the most immediate relief. Couples clasped hands and moved to reels and waltzes with a fervor that seemed to erase the ache in tired backs. Boots thudded, skirts swirled, and sometimes bare feet found the rhythm truer than anything else could. For a while, the grind of work and the weight of risk gave way to the simple mathematics of two bodies finding time together in the same moment. Courtship and consolation, rivalry and reconciliation, all were played out in the space of a tune. Between the clink of tools at dawn and the quiet of the next day's rise, music, theater, and dancing held the settlements together. They were never mere pastimes, but a necessary breath, a reminder that even in the pursuit of fortune, people needed to be people first, to sing, to laugh, to cry, to dance. For a few hours, under open sky or canvas, the goldfields glittered not with metal alone, but with the living, urgent light of community. Gallop for Gold, a little tune with the modest dedication to everybody from Henry Marsh, holds more than a few notes. It carries the memory of people on the road. Imagine long lines of hopeful travelers moving toward the gold fields, their wagons sagging with tools and blankets, but never quite empty of the small portable instruments they refused to leave behind. These musical diggers traveled as much by rhythm and habit as by shovel and pan, folding a piece of home into every dusty mile. They didn't bring polished orchestral gear. Their music sprang from necessity and imagination, from whatever the land and wagons would spare. A penny tin whistle, its lips smoothed by breath and years, threaded a thin, piercing tune that could cut through morning dust. A dish-bottom, flipped and lashed into a drum, kept a steady heartbeat under boots and chatter. And in clever hands, a meat hook, a horseshoe, and a spoon could be coaxed into a set of crude triangles, chiming sharp and clear through fog at dawn, or the hush of a late campfire. Those odd objects became talismans. Every bent spoon and battered tin told a story of making do, of small triumphs and quiet jokes in the face of hard work. The sounds they made, high hollow whistles, dry metallic tinks, the low thud of improvised drums, did more than fill the air. They braided strangers into companions, brightening hunger and fatigue as surely as a shared meal. In that rugged landscape, where the promise of gold pulled people together, song and invention stitched a fragile community. Given that makeshift orchestra, Henry Marsh's simple dedication to everybody feels less modest and more like an invitation, a call to anyone passing through to join the music, if only for a mile. At the time of the Ballarat rush, there were bands of roving musicians weaving through the camps. One remembered brass band, led by a Mr. Hoare, set out from Geelong in 1852 and played "The Girls We Left Behind Us" until the tune was familiar as dust on a boot. These local players arrived with goodwill and little else. Their limited repertoires sometimes left a hungry crowd restless, who preferred the novelty of professional acts flown in from distant cities and ports. When the goldfields rose like a fever across the hills and river bends, miners did not live by pick and pan alone. Beside drab tents, hastily raised bark huts, and blackened claim shelters, another kind of structure appeared. Sometimes a curtained stage cobbled into a shed, or sometimes a lean-to of planks and rough timber, sometimes no more than a cleared patch of ground beneath the stars. There, men and women gathered to be reminded of the world they had left behind. Theater came with the gold, not as a polite ornament, but as a vital pulsing necessity, a way to laugh and cry and dream together, to measure civility against the rawness of the diggings. Professional entertainers were the traveling doctors of the spirit. They arrived from the old theaters of London, the music halls of America, and the ports in between, often ragged and hungry like the audiences they sought. They brought trunks of costumes, battered scenery, and scripts thumbed by long journeys. Sometimes a troupe of 5, an actor-manager, an actress, a musician, and a pair of lads who could change scenery in the dark, set up in a hotel parlor pressed into service. Other nights, a single showman appeared with a stool and a pile of handbills, a conjurer, a comic, a singer, ready to work a crowd into laughter or tears. Programs were a mosaic designed to suit a rough democracy of tastes. An evening might begin with instrumental airs and glees, slip into comic song and monologue, swell into a dramatic scene, a tearful tableau of lost love or sudden betrayal, and finish with burlesque or acrobatic feats. Men hardened by long hours at the claim could be reduced to tears by a tragic heroine's lament. Women and children scarce on the fields found in the music a touchstone to home and manners. Miners stamped boots to a jig, hissed when the villain raised his voice, threw coins into collection hats, and yelled for encores. These were rough-hewn theaters of feeling, loud, immediate, and spectacularly alive. Staging was improvisation at its most practical poetry. Drawn curtains were often hospital sheets, or the heavy canvas of a covered cart. Scenery might be painted canvas pinned to rough frames. Gaslight was commonly replaced by smoking oil lamps whose flames sputtered in the drafts. When the wind rose, it was an actor's art to keep a cape from snapping and a soliloquy from being carried away with the dust. Such limitations sharpened performance. Actors learned to speak plainly and to find the common chord in every line. Melodrama flourished because its gestures were large enough to reach even the meanest room. Comedy cut through the day's tension, and singing filled the silence between sips of grog and the clink of dice. These companies were more than entertainers. They were social importers. They carried songs and fashions of metropolitan stagecraft, teaching the colonies new tastes, and by performing on the field, lending a fledgling town a kind of legitimacy. A settlement that could host a decent play announced itself as more than a scatter of tents. It had culture, civic ambition, and the permanence that might persuade a shopkeeper or minister to stay. Dance halls became courtrooms by day, and theaters by night. The theater itself turned into a civic forum. Traveling lecturers, readers, and singers filled a public hunger for debate and diversion. Temperance meetings, eisteddfods, and philanthropic concerts stood alongside bawdier entertainments, each stitching another thread into the social fabric. The entertainments mirrored the mercurial population. Where companies were larger, one could hear a chorus. Where there was a single star, the magic was in their presence. Opera arias were sometimes attempted by local amateurs and later by touring divas. Shakespeare survived, often in truncated form, and melodrama reigned because its moral certainties suited men who had come to test their fortunes. Burlesque and pantomime provided release, lampooning manners, exaggerating heroes, letting a crude world laugh at itself. Minstrel shows and blackface acts also appeared, drawing crowds and laughter at the time, but leaving behind complex legacies of taste and offense that later generations would have to reassess. Evening after evening, the theater dissolved ordinary lines. A gentleman in his Sunday best might sit beside a miner in a tattered coat, and for the play's length they were equals, held in thrall by a shared story. Women, scarce and often treasured on the fields, were treated with a deference born of scarcity and the old social codes. Their laughter and applause could hush a bawdy crowd, and their presence made the theater a safer, more refined space. For a few hours, the claustrophobic world of claims and shifting fortunes was put aside, and a temporary community glowed into life. Entertainers were masters at reading a room. They knew when to prolong a laugh, when to rush a climax into melodrama, when to soften a line that might offend. They doubled as newsbearers, dissecting the latest gossip, recounting political speeches, or reciting headlines for those who could not read. Their lives were itinerant and precarious. A season of success in one township might be followed by a lean camp where half the diggers had already left. But with every new audience they honed their craft, and some companies and performers who cut their teeth on the gold fields would go on to shape theatrical life across the colonies. When populations shifted, so did the theaters. Temporary tents and sheds where they lasted, gave way to more permanent halls of brick and timber, with gas-lit auditoria and balconies. Where a theater took root, it anchored other institutions, schools, banks, libraries. Places that once echoed only with pick and pan came to echo with steps, on polished floors and applause measured in seconds. The presence of a professional company validated a town's hopes and anchored a sense of permanence. And perhaps the most enduring image is a simple one. A cold, clear night after rain, lamps haloing the faces of farmers, shopkeepers, and miners. The stage itself a small, bright island, where the story being told feels as urgent as any claim. Laughter washes like water over the rafters. The final scene draws silence and then a rush of fists and tears. For a little while, the hard, pragmatic life of the fields is replaced by the shared illusion of the stage. Voices together, stories that matter. What the theaters and entertainers truly brought to the Goldfields was not merely amusement, but a sense of community, of belonging, and of a world that might hold more than the next pan of dirt. As Goldfield towns rose up almost overnight, theaters and concert halls sprang up with them. Often nothing more than a stage under canvas, a few rows of benches, and a lantern or two. Professional entertainers came with the rush. Singers, dancers, a flash of city manners set down on a raw frontier. Charles Thatcher toured the diggings and sang to great acclaim. Lola Montez toured as well, drawing crowds and, in her case, a good deal of consternation. These travelers brought spectacle and gossip, but it was the quieter figures who anchored a town's nights. Men like Thatcher, who moved between song and service with a kind of private authority. He stands behind the counter like a weathered poem, part performer, part tradesman, part keeper of other people's evenings. The name Charles Thatcher is on the town's lips, both as entertainer and as grog seller. To call him a minstrel tells one half of the story. To call him the grog seller tells the other. Between the songs and the mugs, he builds a peculiar intimacy with miners, draymen, lonely clerks, and wives who come seeking a small, secret solace. He keeps their laughter and their sorrows on his breath, the way incense hangs in a chapel, a familiar lingering scent. Picture a door opening on a winter evening and a rush of warm, tobacco-sweet air. Inside the room is dim. Lanterns gutter on a high beam, casting long shadows, and the floor is strewn with sawdust that muffles footsteps and catches spilled ale. Around a central table the patrons cluster. Talk is loud. Jokes come quick. The pauses are heavy with meaning. At the far end, propped against a brace, is a battered guitar or a worn fiddle, whispering of 1,000 nights. It is in this half-light that Thatcher takes his place. Not merely a singer of ballads, but a teller of other people's stories, turning raw experience into rhythms and lines that give shape to work, longing, and the small sharp griefs of daily life. When he opens a song, his voice is roughened by smoke and long calling, but it bends toward melody and memory. He knows where to push a line for laughter and where to let silence do the work of 1,000 words. He can catch a laugh in the throat of a man who has been too proud to smile all day. He can pull breath from a sob with a phrase that names the thing hurting. Then when he wedges a chorus into a room, something communal happens. The hard edges of a long day soften, the ache of separation is shared for an hour, and even the proudest rowdies lower their shoulders. Thatcher has a gambler's sense of timing and a coachman's feel for direction. He steers the mood as much as he fills the air with song. Behind the singer and beside the storyteller is commerce in its most human form. The title grog seller is blunt and honest. He mixes spirits and water, pours ale by the pint and the tankard, offers bread with cheese, keeps a ledger, and sometimes forgives a debt with a look. The counter becomes a kind of altar of consolation. Miners hand over a pound and leave lighter for a night. A sailor will slump into a corner and let both his body and his voice unwind. Thatcher stands between these exchanges, both steward and scribe. He hears confessions, remembers them, and reflects them back in song, so that the tavern becomes a mirror in which everyone can see themselves. There is a rhythm to his nights. He tends the bar until the room has the right density for a story. A few eager faces, a cluster of hardened ones, a woman with something in her eyes. And then he steps forward. His repertoire is a patchwork. A line from an old country ballad here, a freshly stitched verse there, an occasional sharp topical ditty that mentions a scandal or a small triumph everyone knows about. He sings about work and want, about the ways men gamble away fortunes and the ways women hold households together in their absence. He does not preach. He laughs with the crowd, and when a joke cuts too close, he lets mercy show through even the bitterest line. People come to him not only for melody, but for the clarity his songs provide. In his strains you can hear the map of a community's anxieties and pleasures. His songs name what is happening at the kitchen table and at the edge of town. When a new hardship comes, a new rhythm arrives at his fingertips, and quickly becomes a verse everyone knows by heart. When a neighbor thrives, he shapes the celebration so that joy spreads like warm light. In these ways he is both chronicler and conscience, a living newspaper that appears at dusk, with a tune rather than print, and yet there is a private man beneath the public face. He tends the ledger with care, wipes a glass clean with a cloth worn soft by repeated use, observes habits, and knows which customers carry grief like an old coat, and which wear it like a second hat. He is practical as well as poetic. Bottles are organized, spoons polished, kettles kept ready. In the small economies of human comfort, a steady hand behind the counter matters as much as the sharpness of a verse. No single evening fully explains him, and no single song contains the entirety of his compassion. He is a study in contrasts, a minstrel who traffics in the deepest emotions, and a tradesman who counts coppers, a public entertainer whose quietest moments are spent listening. To stand in his presence is to feel the combustible warmth of a community that, for an hour or two, is made coherent by laughter, music, and the steady pour of grog. That is his art and his trade. To turn the rawness of daily life into something singable, something bearable, and when the night comes to its end, to hand his patrons back to the dark, with a lighter step and a new line in their mouths. Charles Thatcher was a flautist by trade, a man whose fingers knew the cramped, exacting language of orchestral scores from the concert rooms of London. He stepped off the ship in Melbourne in 1852, the year itself feeling charged with possibility. News of alluvial gold had set men moving like flocks, and Thatcher, keen to try his luck, answered the same call that pulled so many away from home, the promise of a sudden strike, the hope that a single pan might change a life. He joined the ragged ranks at Bendigo, taking his place among claimant tents and muddy gullies. There he learned the rhythm of the pick and the pan, feeling the hard, patient work settle into his shoulders, and the endless, dusty light bruise his face. Around him were the familiar signs of disappointment, the quiet stubbornness of men who had been pulled to the diggings by glitter and found only grit. When the strikes did not come, Thatcher did not force himself to be someone he was not. He laid aside the pick and reclaimed his flute, returning to the craft that had shaped him. Stepping back into performance, he carried with him the same disciplined grace honed in London orchestras, a steadiness that turned his music into both livelihood and language. His return was not a defeat, but a kind of reckoning. Some talents, once worn into the hands and heart, are not easily traded away. In the end, the fortune he found was different from the one he had chased on the goldfields. Quieter, yet lasting. A life made rich by art and by the music that became his true voice. He wrote lyrics to popular tunes that named the dust and the heartbreak of life on the diggings. Those songs caught on quickly, sung under awnings and over campfires, printed in newspapers and hawked on broadsides, and people hummed them when they walked the dusty streets. Among the characters his verses sketched was one the town never quite stopped talking about. Big Pole, the grog seller whose little tent was as much a landmark as the claim posts themselves. Big Pole is up before most of the town, long before the sun has finished spilling gold across the roofs. She lifts the flap of her small, rowdy tent, shakes the sleep from the canvas, and sends a plume of dust to settle in the cool morning air. Her hand is quick with the broom. She sweeps the earth clean in a practiced arc, chasing out last night's bottle tops and the footprints of men who came and left with laughter or argument under the lantern. The tent is nothing grand, but it holds life and noise. A rough counter, a few wooden stools scarred with years of elbows, and the familiar jumble of jars and bottles that promise heat and forgetfulness in equal measure. She knows where the kettle goes on the fire, where to tuck the best spirits out of sight, and which jars to set within reach when weary men need something to warm them. It's a small, well-ordered theater of comfort and commerce. By the time the day begins to stir, coins are already finding their way into Pole's palm. People say she's turning in plenty of tin, the compliment threaded with admiration and a little envy, and she hears the gossip without letting it show. There is a steadiness to her that speaks of experience, the exact pressure to pour a measure, the smile to soften an angry word, the steady hand when a purse is light. Polly, called Pole by everyone who passes through that flap, has a presence that draws the eye without asking for it. She is plain and honest-looking in a way that belies her sharpness, young perhaps, but with a gaze that steadies a room. Her hair is a thing of note, thick, glossy, sometimes pinned back, sometimes falling over her shoulder, catching the light when she leans to pour a measure. There's an innocence in the curve of her cheek and the lift of her brows that makes strangers judge her kindly, then leave puzzled when they meet the mind beneath. Her tongue is smooth and oily, not cruelly so, but like oil on a hinge, making talk run easy. She flatters, jokes, listens. She turns rough remarks into laughter and sour moods into another purchase. The ease of her speech is a skill as useful as any tool behind the counter, and it brings the coins that keep the place going. Noonday finds the tent full. The air inside is thick with tobacco and the tang of spirits, voices rising and falling like the tide. Young fellows park themselves on the stools with work-stained hands and boots full of dust, bringing stories and songs that quicken the life of the place. They leave with lighter pockets and heavier steps, sometimes with a newfound certainty, sometimes only with a grin to carry away. Pole listens, weighs and answers, her laugh ringing above the clink of tin and glass. As evening comes, the tent settles into a different kind of brightness. Lanterns swing, stories grow longer, and jokes get louder to match the dark outside. Coins continue to fall into Pole's bowl, and in the quiet moments between customers, she counts them, a small ritual that seals the day. Through it all, there is the same quiet truth. Pole rises each morning, tends her place with care, and moves through the day with a confidence that keeps the town talking. She knows what she's about. When you hear the name of Thatcher's song, Pole the Grog Seller, it comes across like a small, weathered relic from a harsher place and time. A tune that, with a single phrase, lifts from the dirt of the gold field a chorus of women who lived and worked at the edges of a male-dominated boom. The song doesn't cast them as saints or sinners. It simply remembers them, gives them a voice in the clatter and clamor of the diggings. Thatcher's lines sketch their presence with the plain, unpretentious sympathy of someone who had seen the long, practical bargains of frontier life. Picture the gold fields, a scatter of canvas and timber, the thin blue smoke of cooking fires, men bent over pans and sluices, the metallic glint of hope in the mud. Into that scene stepped the grog seller, footfall quiet, eyes wary, practiced smile that could turn away trouble. She moved through camps and tent lines with a rhythm that matched the digger's work, offering a hot or bitter drink that warmed cold hands and steadied weary nerves. Thatcher's song makes clear that grog selling was no affectation or pastime. It was work. One of the small, steady ways women carved a living from a landscape that offered few safe or reliable options. A cup of illicit alcohol was only one coin in a larger economy of survival. The woman who carried jugs might also patch a shirt, mend a boot, take in laundry, or cook a stew for a claim-holding crew. Those jugs were part of a broader daily strategy, tools of trade, and of survival in equal measure. There is, woven into the refrain and left deliberately in the light, another harder thread, the suggestion that prostitution was sometimes bound up with the trade in grog. Thatcher doesn't shout it or hide it. The image hangs there like a half-lit street at dusk, an acknowledgment of the desperate choices forced on women where social structures were thin and the law barely reached. The melody does more than name an act of commerce. It remembers the layered reputations these women bore, the whispers and hard pragmatisms that trailed them through camp and tavern alike. Those reputations were part of the work, as much a currency as coin or kindness, shaping how a woman moved and survived among men who measured worth differently. In Thatcher's telling, the grog seller is both figure of utility and figure of moral ambiguity, a person who negotiated dignity and danger in the same breath. He sings of survival, of human commerce pressed into every crevice of frontier life. And he does so without easy judgment. The result is a portrait that feels honest rather than moralizing. By giving them a line in a song, Thatcher turned a transient presence into something lasting, a voice for a class of people too often erased from the official histories of the gold rush. The tune holds that memory like smoke in the air, a smoky, honest testament to the women whose work kept a hard-edged society moving, and to the complicated livelihoods they led at the margins of fortune and law. Women on the goldfields did more than carry pans and water. They also carried drink. Sometimes, folded beneath the skirts and aprons, they concealed a bulky tin the size of a family Bible, a hidden supply of grog pressed close to the body, part contraband, part livelihood. The tin sat against her like a secret. Flat and cold, squat and solid, it changed the way she moved, forcing a careful balance with every step. It was the sort of thing a doctor might once have recommended, filled with hot water and pressed to the chest to ease coughing, a crude comfort against the ache of lung infections. The simple hope was warmth, something to steady a shallow breath, a heat laid against ribs to soothe the thin, rattling coughs that haunted too many throats on the diggings. But between that earnest comfort and the hard need to survive, the tin changed shape. Where steam might once have fogged its rim, there now rose the heavier scent of spirits. What had been a vessel for healing became a pocket bar. Practicality and necessity made the swap almost inevitable. A container meant to sit near the skin and keep its contents at hand was perfect for storing something stronger, something worth money to the thirsty and the desperate. She wore it tucked into the side pocket of her dress, the weight pressing her hip and directing a slow, deliberate waddle as she threaded the gullies. Narrow, shaded alleys swallowed sound, turning each footfall into a quieter rhythm of cloth and tin. A thin tube poked through the pocket like an odd utensil, the small nozzle that made the hidden cargo a public thing. With a practiced flick, she would draw out a serve, and hands would reach. Rough palms, knuckles dug with work, coins flashing in the dim. Each small measure cost a shilling. The price was as steady as her step. A shilling bought a portion of warmth, a brief thaw against the cold, and the worry that had driven a man to those alleys. The tin that had once been about healing had become an intimate contraption of survival and commerce, bumping against her hip as she moved among the diggers. 1 shilling at a time, she negotiated food and shelter, company and protection, keeping a secret and keeping herself afloat in a world that demanded both. In the mid-19th century, the world was full of dangers you might not expect. A Victorian government inquiry in 1853 into the sly grog trade revealed that the alcohol being sold on the streets was frighteningly strong and often poisoned with strange additives. Grog sold as brandy could be cheap liquor doctored with tobacco and pharmaceutical spirits. One cocktail with a name that left no room for doubt, Blow My Head Off, was a lethal recipe. Poisonous cocculus indicus berries, spirits of wine, turkey opium, cayenne pepper, a splash of rum and water. It was the kind of era where thirst and appetite met risk at the same counter, a sharp detail of the noisy, dangerous world into which some extraordinary figures strode. Out of that world, though born a little earlier and a little gentler, came Eliza Rosanna Gilbert. She arrived on 17th of February, 1821, in the soft green hush of the Irish countryside, a child of damp hills and patient light. That quiet beginning did not confine her. With a quick mind and a hunger for spectacle, Eliza would shed her given name like an old coat and become someone the world had never quite seen before. Lola Montez, a Spanish dancer of velvet and fire. On stage, she moved like a rumor, sudden and impossible to ignore. She wore the borrowed colors of Spain, low-cut bodices and swaying skirts, dark eyes that dared you not to look. She built a persona at once exotic and intimate, a performer who made scandal a part of the act. In the theater, she could summon a hush, heavy as a held breath, often by fixing a single man with a look, and turn that second into a sensation. Critics accused her of deception, calling her an actress who trafficked in tricks. Her fans called her genius. Either way, she had an uncanny gift for making moments larger than life. Her fame moved her beyond the stage, into rooms where desire and power braided together. In the mid-1840s, her path crossed with King Ludwig I of Bavaria, an aging monarch with a grand romantic streak. He fell for her, as men of art and power sometimes do, lavishing jewels and palaces and granting her a title, Countess of Landsfeld. That title was more than ornament. In the glittering court of Munich, Lola's voice began to carry weight. Ministers who expected to shape policy found a dancer's opinions arriving at the king's table, and to their dismay, altering the conversation. That intimacy became a fuse. To many Bavarians, she was an outrage. A foreigner with theatrical manners who seemed to have a corrosive hold on their sovereign. Students and conservatives, intellectuals and citizens rallied around the sense that the court had been debased by royal excess. Pamphlets and protests swelled until they became something larger, a rising tide of discontent. In 1848, the turmoil reached a peak. Faced with public fury and political pressure, Ludwig found himself unable to resist the current. He abdicated, and historians have ever since pointed to Lola Montez as one of the sparks that helped ignite the crisis. Exile did not quiet her. If anything, it unfettered her restless energy. She reinvented herself again and again, traversing an increasingly connected world. She sailed to the United States and took its stages, where audiences hungry for the latest European sensation followed every new name. She crossed oceans to the distant colonies, and in Australia and the fevered tents of California's gold rush, she danced for miners and merchants, for the hopeful and the desperate. Each new theater received her like a comet, brilliant, disruptive, unforgettable. Tales of her spider-like dances and the way she cut through social convention with a single smile traveled faster than the ship that bore her. Through all those changes, she remained a study in contradictions. She was a shrewd self-maker who understood how to command attention, and she was also a woman whose vulnerabilities became painfully plain when the lights went down. Admirers admired the bravery of her reinventions. Her critics loathed her for refusing the narrow roles assigned to women of her time. She courted danger and consequence as if they were fashionable accessories, and she paid for that daring in exile, scandal, and the unpredictable hand of fortune. Her life came to an end, far from the soft green fields of her childhood. On 17th January 1861, she drew her last breath in the clamor of New York City. She was buried in Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery, under stones that would keep her name visible to those who sought it out. Historians and storytellers have debated her meaning ever since. Was she a cunning manipulator who used beauty as leverage, a boundary-pushing artist, or simply a woman who made choices her polite contemporaries could not accept? Whatever judgment you choose, Lola Montez's life endures as a story of transformation, An Irish girl named Eliza became Lola and forced Europe and the new American and colonial worlds to reckon with a woman who refused to be small. Her dances faded into memory, her scandals into history books, but the image lingers. A woman in scarlet and shadow, commanding a room with one look, altering the course of a king, and traveling the globe as her own singular force. They called her Lola Montez, and on the goldfields her name moved like a live spark through the ring of campfires and canvas tents. Wherever men bent over pick and pan, trading the hard, impatient talk of strangers, her reputation arrived first. An international celebrity dropped into a place that swallowed news slowly and treasured novelty fiercely. For those who came hungry for gossip as much as gold, she was a bright, impossible figure, glamorous, dangerous, unapologetic, as if someone had stepped out of a storybook and into the sun-bleached world of the miners. Her presence could turn an ordinary night into an occasion. Crowds clustered, voices hushed, and the usual clatter of camp life softened at the hint of her arrival. No one could agree where she truly came from. Spanish, Cuban, Indian, Turkish. A dozen exotic labels clung to her like costume trimmings, each new suggestion feeding the rumor mill and the imaginations of men starved for spectacle. Those guesses made her larger than life, adding fresh color to the spinning stories that followed her like a trail of light. Yet beneath the swirl of exotic origins there lay a quieter, steadier fact. She had been born Elizabeth Rosanna Gilbert in 1821 in County Sligo, Ireland. That birth name and place acted like an anchor behind the flamboyant narratives, a reminder that every myth begins with a human life. The contrast between the ragged earnestness of the diggings and the cultivated air that surrounded her only deepened the fascination. Listen to the men who remembered her, and you heard 1,000 versions of the same truth. She carried a presence powerful enough to make people forget a long day's toil and, for a little while, imagine a world of music, movement, and unbounded possibility. Even when her story was reduced to a name on a playbill or a whispered anecdote beside a fire, she changed the dusty plains and rough shanties into a stage where people could dream. The facts, her fame on the goldfields, the wild guesses about her origins, and the plain record of Elizabeth Rosanna Gilbert's Irish birth in 1821 are small compass points. Around them spun a vivid legend. Whether Irish by birth or imagined otherwise, she became an unforgettable presence in a place that was hungry for wonder, a living spark that lingered long after the campfires dimmed. In 1843, she stepped into the world she would come to inhabit, though not yet under the name the public would learn to whisper. 4 months of concentrated dance tuition, long days of repetition, stern instruction, and quiet, relentless practice had reformed her body and sharpened a growing image in her mind. A short visit to Spain left its mark on her imagination, and when the time came, she chose for herself a new identity. Lola Montez. The name was not a mere affectation, but a careful adoption, a bright, foreign-sounding banner under which she would present the persona she had been shaping, both in the studio and on the road. Her first appearance on stage was modest in circumstance and electric in effect. She did not open the evening as the main attraction, but slipped into the shadows between the grander acts, dancing during the intervals of opera evenings. Picture an old playhouse, The hush before the curtain, the gleam of gaslight on polished wood, the soft smell of grease paint and velvet, the clustered murmurs of an expectant crowd. Into that scene she moved, each practiced step revealing the months of tuition behind it. Every turn and flourish read like a concise declaration of arrival. The applause she received in those opera intervals was the first measure of a new life, the sound that confirmed her choice of name and marked the beginning of a career that would be tasted in brief, brilliant moments between one great work and the next. She had a knack for dancing, but it was her looks and the aura that followed her which opened doors. Beauty and celebrity rode her like twin companions. They gathered a devoted following across Europe and earned her invitations to the best salons and the grandest stages. In Berlin she stood before King Friedrich Wilhelm IV and won his attention, and offstage she collected lovers as casually as applause. Among them the brilliant, temperamental composer Franz Liszt. By the time she stepped onto Australian soil in 1855, the seams of her life were stitched from 1,000 performances. She had learned her trade on the worn boards of provincial playhouses and under the glitter of great European theaters. With every town she left behind, something new sat in her voice and walked in her posture. Dresden taught her the quiet art of tragedy, where candlelight and velvet seats demanded a slow, interior burn. In Berlin she found audiences that listened like critics and applauded like friends. Burlesque there sharpened her timing and gave her the license to mock the world with a knowing gleam. Warsaw showed her how to bend feeling into melody and memory, while St. Petersburg instructed a different lesson: how to hold herself upright beneath winter ceilings heavy with expectation. Paris wrapped her in a bracing sophistication, Munich gave her the gentle rhythms of provincial wit, and far across the Atlantic San Francisco offered a raw, eager public, hungry for novelty and distraction. She moved through dramas, burlesques, and light comedies as if through different rooms of the same house, each genre carving a new facet into her craft. The slow, aching truth of drama, the nimble irreverence of burlesque, the bright relief of comedy. By the time the ship's hull cut through the Southern Ocean, she no longer had a single voice but a chorus, an arsenal of styles ready for whatever stage lay ahead. Australia was not a blank page for her. She arrived as an actress rehearsed by boulevards and wharves alike, every curtain call a small map pointing toward the next city, the next audience, the next transformation. She arrived in Sydney from California in August 1855 and opened at the Royal Victoria Theatre, then the oldest and most popular playhouse in the city, its stalls and galleries able to hold around 3,000 people. The building hummed with expectation, gaslights casting warm pools of light over a sea of faces, the murmur of a crowd waiting for novelty in a town that was still finding its rhythms. At first the house was less than full. Audience numbers were not particularly strong, and the manager must have felt the familiar worry of every impresario, a grand stage and too few patrons to fill it. The turning point came when she advertised her famous spider dance. The poster promised something strange and alluring, and curiosity did what no handbill had managed before. It drew people in, row upon row, until the theater's great belly was stirred with the shiver of a shared spectacle. If you have the newspaper fragment you want expanded, paste it here or upload it, and I'll transform it into a vivid audiobook-style narrative about 5 times longer, while keeping all facts, dates, and key events unchanged. If you have any preferences, tell me your desired final word count or approximate duration, the tone you prefer. Warm, urgent, wistful, formal, and any names or phrases you especially want emphasized. Once you paste the fragment, I'll produce a single continuous polished narration ready for recording. The full perfection of her form was revealed as she swung gracefully to the center of the stage and paused for a moment, the lights sharpening every line of silk and skin. She made it seem as if she were caught in a spider's web. With a dancing step, she showed growing confusion as invisible filaments wrapped about her ankles. The music slowed, and, in that hush, she felt a spider in her petticoat and tried to shake it loose. One discovery led to another. She examined her skirts, shook them out, and more spiders tumbled free, each little finding coaxing a new reaction from her body. The struggle began almost as a whisper, and then swelled into a roar. At first her movement was casual, a teasing to the melody that sent the stage lights shivering across her costume and made the audience lean forward as if hearing a secret. But as the imagined danger crept nearer, something in her shifted. Her body answered the rising tempo, hips that had laughed now pitched forward with purpose, hands that had fluttered like fans cut the air in sharp, sure arcs. What started as a playful reveal became a frantic contest, each step and gesture a reply to an invisible, advancing threat. The orchestra pushed her on, first a pulse, then a drumbeat, then a fever, and she met it with everything she had. She danced with abandon and a fierce control, reckless and exact at once. Her skirts flared like tongues of flame. Her bare feet hammered the boards in a rhythm that sounded like trying to stamp out the tiny enemies she pretended to fight. Under the lamps, her face was both a mask of concentration and a blaze of feeling. Fear hardened into defiance, beauty turned to battle. When she whirled, the sequins scattered like sparks. When she lunged, the audience instinctively recoiled, sensing the peril she dared to make real. As the climax approached, she seemed to gather the last of her will into those final, frantic steps. From the hems of her skirts, the spiders spilled across the stage, small dark things driven out by movement and mood. With a final, almost ceremonial series of stamps and wide sweeps, she shook them onto the floor and stamped them flat. No careless flourish, but the decisive cruelty the choreography demanded. Each heavy footfall left a ringing punctuation that hung in the air like a verdict. For a moment the theater was suspended. People held their breath. The performance had been daring and unsettling, and the audience sat spellbound, some faces gone pale in the glow of the boxes, a low chorus of gasps threading the rows. Then the tension broke. The shock and wonder swelled into a sudden tidal applause that filled the house and would not be silenced. When the dance finally ended, the clapping was thunderous, rolling and crashing until the stage seemed to tremble under its insistence. She answered that roar, returning to the stage again and again. After many curtain calls, she stood to speak, bowing a little breathless, her chest still rising with the echoes of the piece. She addressed them with the calm authority of someone who had risked everything for a singular truth. Bouquets were showered at her feet, soft explosions of scent and color that rolled across the boards and came to rest against her shoes. For all the shock she had provoked, the evening closed with one unmistakable verdict: astonishment, admiration, and an audience unwilling to let her go. It was at the Victoria Theatre in Ballarat, in the year 1856, that she made an impression the town would not easily forget. The lamps threw a warm, trembling glow across the wooden benches and the painted proscenium. The air held the hush and the low anticipatory murmur of a crowd gathered to be entertained, to be shocked, to be moved. On that stage, she emerged as a figure both fascinating and reproachful, a performer whose name for many came to mean a single, unforgettable act: the Spider Dance. The Spider Dance itself was a thing of electric rumor and spectacle, the kind of act that sent people talking in lanes and parlors long after the curtain fell. Critics and curious alike flocked to see it. When the Sydney Morning Herald took up the task of judging that performance, it did so without finesse, calling the dance the most libertinish and indelicate performance that could be given on the public stage. Words like that, printed in a paper of record, pinned a public label on her: a transgressive presence, alluring to some and affronting to others. But to reduce her to a single scandalous moment would be to miss the fuller shape of her stage life. She moved with lightness and timing in comedies such as Morning Call, where wit mattered as much as grace, and she could summon tension and peril in dramas like Maidens Beware, inhabiting the darker notes the script demanded. Still, despite that range, the Spider Dance lodged most firmly in Ballarat's imagination, a provocative emblem that outshone, in memory if not in truth, the many other faces she showed beneath the theatre lights. Lola enjoyed heckling her audiences when they criticized her. In Castlemaine, Victoria, she told a crowd one night that she was too tired to do the Spider Dance, and was promptly hissed at, jeered, and called a coward. She answered them without hesitation, letting the jeers hang in the air. She was worth £70,000 and did not care a pin for the audience. The reply landed like a challenge and a laugh at once, the kind of sharp, fearless remark that made people either furious or oddly impressed. That same boldness followed her beyond the footlights and into places where most performers never went. She became a fixture among the men who worked underground, a bright, fearless presence they talked about with easy affection. On one afternoon, with the shaft open behind her and a coil of rope at her feet, she did something that settled any remaining doubt about her nerve. At the mouth of the shaft, she slipped one foot into a simple noose, looped the rope once, and let herself be guided over the void. In her other hand, she held a single glass of champagne, a fragile, shimmering thing that caught what light there was and trembled with tiny, laughing bubbles. The shaft yawned beneath her like a throat of shadow. For a moment everything narrowed to the hush of held breath and the soft creak of rope. Then she began to descend, slow and deliberate, moving as if along a narrow stage where every inch was measured by confidence rather than caution. The champagne did not spill. It stayed calm in its glass, as if in deference to the steadiness of her hand. Around the rim the miners craned their necks, faces upturned, voices rising in a wild, uncontained applause that rolled down the shaft. They whooped and clapped in that raw, honest way reserved for a rare mixture of courage and showmanship, and the sound followed her like music, an escort into the dark. The whole moment held like a photograph: rope, glass, a woman moving into shadow, while a chorus of admiration swelled above her, full of amazement at the daring and the bond it had forged. She sailed from Sydney to San Francisco in May of 1856. 4 years later, she died in Brooklyn, New York. She was reputed to be only in her early 40s. I'm ready to do this, but I don't see the historical fragment you want expanded. Please paste the original text, or confirm you want me to work from general historical knowledge about subscription balls and social dancing. A few quick choices that will help me deliver exactly what you want. Do you want a particular voice or narrator style? Warm and intimate, dramatic, formal, playful? Any specific region or time period emphasis? For example, London and the Regency era, American cities in the 19th century, or continental Europe. And what about length or running time? You asked for 5 times longer. Roughly how many words or minutes should the final narration be? Paste the fragment and any preferences, and I'll transform it into a vivid audiobook-ready narrative while keeping all facts, dates, and key events exactly as given. You can almost step into one of S.T. Gill's watercolors and hear the scrape of a fiddler's bow over the murmur of voices. His sketches caught more than faces and fashions. They caught sound and motion, the scrape of boots on a rough floor, the hush as a tune began, the sudden swell of conversation that followed. By day the diggers stood elbow-deep in sluice or shaft, sunlight sharp on pans and pick. By night those same people turned the rough timber halls and makeshift stages into rooms of warmth and color, where life felt for a few hours less hard. There was a kind of deliberate eagerness to these evenings. A ball on the goldfields was an excuse to enjoy what luck had handed you and to show it. New coins changed hands in quiet pockets, and a lucky seam might be read in the cut of a sleeve, or the glint at a throat. Men and women who at dawn had no time for neatness would at dusk lift their heads, smooth the dust from coats, press skirts that had been mended for months, and set buttons to catch the lantern light. Seeing a neighbor step into finery was its own small celebration, a public airing of private good fortune that made hope feel almost tangible. These gatherings were more than frolic. Many were subscription balls, planned by local committees and paid for by the town itself. A ticket wasn't just entry to a dance. It was a pledge to the common good. The money might go to the hospital that could one day mend a broken arm, or to the fire brigade, whose buckets and ladders kept a blaze from devouring the whole settlement. People gave for the pleasure of the evening, and because the town's fragile safety and health leaned on that charity. Pleasure and duty moved through the room together, hand in hand. Expectations were high and practical. Tables were laid with generous platters, pies, puddings, steaming dishes that smelled of spice and comfort after a day in the open. An orchestra, or at least a cluster of players, was expected to lift the room from chatter to song, measured reels to set the feet, lilting airs to slow them again. Above all, guests expected to be seen. Under gaslight or candle glow, they stood to be admired for the care they had shown, their small victories in coin and industry translated into silk and shine. S.T. Gill's ink and wash caught all of this, the hopeful posture of a miner pausing at the door, the proud tilt of a woman's chin as lantern light warmed her dress, the flick of a fiddler's wrist as a tune began. His work holds the brightness of those nights, not just the clothes and the food, but the way people leaned into the chance to feel whole, even if only for an evening. For a few hours, these balls were a pocket of civilization in a rough world. They were social engines that fed purse and pride, pleasure and philanthropy. In that music and candlelight, a community could see itself as prosperous, stable, and beautifully dressed, if only until the morning, when the pans and picks would wait again. Elizabeth Ramsay Lay, an English author visiting the gold diggings, found herself at a ball in Barker's Creek, near Castlemaine in Victoria. She and her husband had joined friends and hired an omnibus that carried all the ladies comfortably, without tumbling or tossing their dresses about. A large canvas house had been erected as the ballroom, with smaller tents pitched for refreshments and for the ladies' dressing rooms, a temporary village built for an evening. The scene might have stepped out of Samuel Thomas Gill's Night Concert, Ballarat, 1854, life and art meeting on a frontier night. What surprised the English visitors was not raucousness or frontier roughness, but a sudden careful beauty dropped into the middle of the township, as if to prove that civility could be carried anywhere. Elizabeth could not conceal her delight. The plainness of the settlement seemed to dissolve under the room's decorations, and she watched as familiar comforts were quietly recreated far from home. The ballroom was lined with broad swathes of pink and white calico, a simple fabric turned into elegant drapery when hung in even, generous folds. Artificial flowers were arranged with unexpected taste. Glossy petals and painted leaves caught the light and gave a permanence to the blooms of a borrowed garden. Even the pillars that held up the roof were not left bare. They were wrapped in garlands, pink braided through white and white, threading back into pink, until the supports themselves read like ornaments. As lamps glowed and music rose, the whole place seemed to breathe. Light traveled across the calico and the glossy surfaces of the flowers, throwing soft shadows that shifted with every movement on the floor. Conversations and the murmur of the orchestra blended with the rustle of silk and the little clink of glasses. The room changed shape under the play of sound and color, becoming at once intimate and celebratory. That unexpected tenderness of color and craft stayed with Elizabeth. What might have been only a makeshift shelter became a scene of deliberate cheerfulness, an attempt to bring a drawing room's comforts to an unlikely place. She recorded the impression with pleased amazement, noting how a few careful touches could lift the ordinary into something almost ceremonial. The effect was charming. The adjoining tents were lit with Chinese lamps and fitted up quite luxuriously with carpets, divans, and sofas. The band was excellent, and dancing was kept up with great spirit until daylight. I remember scenes like that, an improvised pageant of light and music pitched against a wide sky, because they show how people here made home out of what they brought with them and what they found. I came to these colonies with all the small hopes and anxieties of someone who has crossed an ocean to a place whose very name promises romance and distance. For 8 years, I watched this new world settle into habit. I watched strangers become neighbors, manners bent and rebent against an open horizon, and the old proprieties of England preserved, altered, or sometimes quietly left behind under a sun that has its own rules. Life here moved to the cadence of 2 great forces, the sea that delivers news, people, and fashions, and the land that resists easy domestication. To arrive by ship is to be initiated into a rhythm of long days at sea. The first glimpse of eucalyptus against a pale sky, a town clustered along the shore, as if leaning toward home. The harbor is the artery of gossip and hope. A letter or a box of English clothes can change the tone of a household for months. People stand on wharves in morning light, scanning the masts for faces from the old country, and before long you learn to measure distance by ship arrivals rather than by miles. Society here is both acutely self-aware and dangerously diffuse. There are deliberate recreations of respectability, tea on breezy verandas, lace and polite conversation, trying to recall a London drawing room, formal balls where fiddles and waltzes sound much the same as across the world, even if dancers sometimes brush past sunburned boots and dust carried from the road. A colonist will dress and arrange her house as if obeying a long line of manners, yet also with a sharp eye for practicality, verandas to catch the breeze, whitewash to fend off heat, wide skirts to shield from wind. Hospitality in the bush is generous and often improvised. A station may be miles from the nearest town, and when a guest arrives, the household reveals the care that underlies kindness. Preserves are rationed into small, cherished jars. The best china appears for one evening, and is then put away like treasure. Visits begin at sunset, and stretch by lamplight into talk of crops, politics, and the latest ship lists, conversations that make life here feel at once precarious and secure. Neighbors are relied upon in ways that sharpen manners into community tools. Good breeding becomes not merely taste, but a currency in the barter of favors. In the towns, clubs and societies flourish as stages for display and exchange. Reading rooms, agricultural societies, and musical evenings draw people together. Men talk briskly about land and legislation at the club. Women meet at committee tables to organize bazaars and charitable appeals. Public life's drama is punctuated by quieter domestic scenes. The needlework circle that comforts the newly arrived. Mothers who receive matrons to learn how to educate their children, and the governess whose presence signals both ambition and necessity. The colonial temperament admires independence and industry. A newcomer with a steady habit or a useful trade is quickly admired, sometimes envied. Yet beneath an outward egalitarianism lies an attachment to rank and precedence that echoes Europe, a delicate insistence on titles, introductions, and the choreography of social intercourse. People import more than fashions and furniture. They bring a sense of propriety, a gentleman's handshake, a lady's curtsy, a properly worded letter still matter, but they are reworked for local life. A bishop may preside over a small congregation, a surgeon must double as a kindly neighbor, and a colonel might find himself sharing rough roads with a man who in England would never consider him an equal. The past is never far from the present. Penal settlements, once filled with transported convicts, have left stories and reputations that color the day. Some families wear that history like a scar. Others try to forget it. Still, the possibility of reinvention is real. People arrive with certain names and statuses and sometimes discard them to become someone different in the sunlight, on a distant paddock, in a town that devours fortunes and remakes manners along the way. Rural life has its own grammar of courtesy. On the station, hospitality is shown through labor and bread. A man's worth is measured by how he tends his land and stock, by his readiness to invite a few weary travelers to sit by the hearth and hear the news a shepherd brings. There is dignity in toil and a rough chivalry among settlers. Women of the bush learn resourcefulness early. They organize social life from what they have, teach their children to be as hardy as the gum trees, keep books, nurse the sick, and host with a frank bonhomie that is itself an education. Entertainment here is usefully inventive. Orchestras form from amateur and professional players alike. Theater troupes journey from overseas trying to recreate London stages. Horse races lure a public hungry for spectacle and chance. Underneath the amusement runs the hum of sharper pursuits. Business deals struck between rides, advances counseled at the race course, marriages arranged on both romantic and pragmatic grounds. Courtship takes on a new urgency when the pool of eligible partners is shaped by migration, mortality, and fortune. Choices are practical, even as they are touched by sentiment. Climate shapes manners as much as custom does. Summer's glare makes for languid afternoons and evenings edged with gold. Winter winds sharpen tongues and tempers. Feasts and fasts follow a different clock here. A cordial offered in the cool of evening is sometimes as welcome as any sermon. Food becomes a fusion of necessity and delight. English recipes adapted to unfamiliar produce, enlivened by strange fruits, sometimes made meager by the limits of supply. Perhaps the most striking quality of colonial society is its capacity for reinvention. Manners are not simply transplanted, they are negotiated. The reserve of Europe meets the directness of the frontier. Politeness meets practicality. A sense of honor adapts to hard geography and distance. In these negotiations, manners become a mirror of a community's wants and fears. The fear of isolation, the desire for respect, the need for mutual reliance. After 8 years of watching and listening, I learned that social life in these colonies is neither mere imitation nor pure innovation. It is a living compromise, respectful, adapted, sometimes rough around the edges, and often warm beyond measure. The people who build lives here do so with an attention to decorum that can surprise a traveler and a resilience that commands admiration. To live here is to learn new etiquettes of kindness and new rituals of welcome, and to see over and over how manners become the soft scaffolding of a society still very much under construction.